Imagine a moment so ordinary, so familiar, that you feel safe, completely at ease, until something happens that shatters that sense of normalcy. Tonight, we share a story that will grip your heart with fear and leave you questioning what you see in the shadows. It's a first-hand account of an encounter with the unexplainable, a tale that is as real as it is terrifying. The person who lived this experience never believed in the supernatural until the night it came to them. A warning before we begin: this story is not for the faint of heart. Turn on the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself to step into a reality where fear takes on a life of its own. But before we dive into this chilling narrative, take a moment to help us bring more stories like this to light. Hit the like button to support our channel, subscribe to Sinister Stories for weekly doses of terror and mystery, and share this video with your friends, especially those who claim they've never been scared. Let's see if they can handle this one. Now let's begin. Picture this: a quiet suburban street, its silence broken only by the faint sounds of laughter and the dull thud of a ball hitting asphalt. It's a familiar scene, a group of friends playing footvolley under the pale yellow glow of flickering streetlights. Everything seems normal, even comforting. The kind of night where worries feel distant and nothing bad could possibly happen. But lurking just beyond the reach of that comforting light, something watches. Something waits. And as the game unfolds, it begins to make itself known. The storyteller, unaware of what lies ahead, recalls feeling a chill that night, a strange sensation, as though the air itself carried an unspoken warning. But they brushed it off, focusing on the game. It was a mistake they would soon regret. As they glanced toward the far end of the street, they noticed a figure emerging from the shadows. At first, it seemed like just another passerby, but as the figure drew closer, its movements were wrong. A heavy, uneven limp, a staggering gait that spoke of pain, or something far worse. And then they saw the details: the torn clothes, the bleeding wounds, and a face devoid of emotion. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just a man. It was something far more unsettling, something that seemed to carry the weight of another world. As fear began to creep into their heart, they realized they couldn't look away. The figure's presence demanded attention, even as it exuded an aura of dread. And then came the most horrifying realization. Their friends, Weslley and Sara, were laughing, playing completely unaware. They hadn't seen him. How could they not see him? The terror of that realization hit harder than anything else. The knowledge that whatever this was, it was meant only for them to see. Stay with us as we uncover what happens next. This is not just a story. It's a warning, a reminder that sometimes, the ordinary can become extraordinary in the most horrifying of ways. This is the beginning of an encounter that will stay with you long after the video ends. If you think you're ready for what's to come, keep watching. But don't say we didn't warn you. The street was the kind you'd find in any quiet neighborhood, lined with modest houses, their windows glowing softly against the encroaching darkness. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of rain that had fallen earlier in the evening. Puddles glistened under the weak, flickering light of the street lamps, which seemed more decorative than functional, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked pavement. A sense of isolation hung in the air, though no one noticed it at first. The kind of isolation that slowly creeps up on you, wrapping itself around your senses like an invisible shroud. It was here, in this seemingly ordinary setting, that a group of friends gathered for a casual game of footvolley. The ball thudded rhythmically against the asphalt, their laughter punctuating the quiet of the night. On the surface, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. The houses stood silent, their interiors cloaked in shadows. Occasionally, a curtain would shift, as if someone were watching, but no one ever stepped outside. The street felt like it had been forgotten by the world, as though it existed in its own pocket of time and space. Playing alongside Weslley and Sara couldn't shake a growing unease. The air felt heavier with each passing moment, a subtle pressure that pressed against their chest. It wasn't just the stillness of the night, it was the silence within that stillness. A silence so profound that it seemed to listen. The hum of the streetlights was muted, the distant rustle of leaves strangely muffled. And then there was the sky. A thick layer of clouds had rolled in, blanketing the stars and plunging the world below into an unnatural dimness. As they played, a subtle shift occurred. It was almost imperceptible at first, like the feeling of being watched. The storyteller glanced toward the far end of the street and froze. A figure had emerged from the darkness, barely illuminated by the flickering street lamp ahead. It was a man, or at least it seemed like one, a silhouette limping toward them with an unnatural, unsteady gait. His body swayed with every step, as though he were being pulled forward by an invisible force. Even from a distance, something about him was wrong. His limbs moved with a jagged rhythm, like a marionette with its strings tangled. The dim light caught on his torn clothes, revealing streaks of what could only be blood running down his arms and legs. His head hung low, but his face, though obscured, seemed unnaturally pale, almost luminous in the gloom. The air grew colder as he approached, a biting chill that cut through their light-hearted game and seeped into their bones. Pulse quickened, but they said nothing, afraid to break the fragile illusion of normalcy. Weslley and Sara continued playing, oblivious to the figure drawing closer. And then it happened. The man stepped into the light, just for a moment. His face, slack and expressionless, was a mask of horror. Scratches covered his skin, deep gashes that oozed slowly. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, like empty sockets staring into nothingness. Gasped, the sound barely audible over the pounding of their own heart. They turned to their friends, expecting them to react, but Weslley and Sara saw nothing. They laughed and teased, their focus unbroken, as if the man didn't exist. Panic surged. Could they really not see him? Or worse, was this figure not meant for them? The man moved past, his head lolling slightly as he limped closer. His gaze never met theirs, yet his presence seemed to fill the air with a suffocating dread. The storyteller's grip on the ball tightened, their breath shallow as the man's form disappeared into the shadows further up the street. And still, their friends remained unaware, the moment passing as if nothing had happened. The street, once a place of familiarity and comfort, now felt alien and hostile. The houses seemed to lean inward, their windows like empty eyes watching the storyteller struggle with a rising terror. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and it was only the beginning. It began as something subtle, almost unnoticeable. The kind of detail you dismiss because it doesn't quite fit the pattern of your expectations. The man had vanished into the shadows at the end of the street, but the air he left behind felt heavy, charged with something unseen. As the storyteller tried to return to the game, their focus wavered. The ball bounced once, twice, and then rolled to their feet, but they couldn't bring themselves to pick it up. Instead, their eyes darted back toward the direction where the man had disappeared, searching for any sign of movement. The street seemed quieter now, unnaturally so. Even the distant hum of insects had faded, replaced by a silence that felt alive. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, pressing against their ears like a physical weight. A soft, rustling sound broke the stillness, so faint it could have been the wind. But there was no wind. The trees stood motionless, their branches stretched out like skeletal arms against the night sky. The storyteller's pulse quickened as the sound grew louder, closer, until it was clear it wasn't coming from the trees. And then came the first undeniable sign. The flickering streetlight above them dimmed, its erratic buzzing growing louder before plunging the area into near darkness. A chill swept through the street, sharp and sudden, as if the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. Weslley noticed it, shivering slightly, but shrugged it off as a passing breeze. Sara laughed nervously, but the storyteller remained frozen, every muscle tense. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and the storyteller was the only one who seemed to sense it. A faint, metallic scent wafted through the air, sharp and acrid, like rust or blood. The storyteller glanced at Weslley and Sara, who continued their game without hesitation. The scent grew stronger, almost choking, as if the air itself were turning thick and metallic. And then, faint but distinct, they heard it, a sound like footsteps, uneven and deliberate, echoing softly against the asphalt. Turned sharply, scanning the street for the source. The footsteps stopped, but there was no one there. For a moment, the street looked the same as always, empty and unremarkable. But as their eyes adjusted to the dim light, they noticed something out of place. At the far end of the street, where the man had vanished earlier, a dark, wet trail glistened faintly on the pavement. It stretched across the road like a smear of shadow, leading from where he had stood to somewhere deeper in the darkness. Stomach turned as they realized what it was. Blood. Thick, viscous, and fresh. Their heart pounded in their chest as a wave of nausea swept over them. They opened their mouth to speak, to call Weslley and Sara's attention to it, but the words caught in their throat. Somehow, they knew instinctively that acknowledging it aloud would make it worse. Suddenly, the faint sound of a whisper cut through the silence. It was barely audible, like a breath against their ear, but its presence was unmistakable. It was a single word, indistinct, garbled, but carrying a weight that sent shivers down their spine. The storyteller spun around, but no one was there. The ball rolled gently across the asphalt, as if nudged by an unseen hand. Sara laughed, oblivious, as Weslley called out to the storyteller, teasing them for zoning out. Tried to shake it off, forcing themselves to smile and act normal. But as they bent to pick up the ball, their eyes caught something, just for a second, in the reflection of a puddle nearby. A face, pale and empty, staring back at them. Not their own face. The face of the man. They stumbled back, their heart racing, but when they looked again, the puddle was empty. Their chest heaved with shallow breaths, their mind racing to make sense of what they had seen. The game resumed, but the storyteller couldn't focus. Their senses were on high alert, picking up every faint noise, every shifting shadow. They felt exposed, vulnerable, as if unseen eyes were tracking their every move. The signs were growing clearer, more undeniable. The man wasn't just a stranger passing through. He was something else, something that had left a mark on the world around him. And now, that mark was spreading, unraveling the thin veil of normalcy that kept the night at bay. The storyteller knew they were in the presence of something far beyond their understanding. And the worst part was, they were completely alone in it. The ball hit the asphalt with a hollow thud, but the storyteller barely noticed. Their mind was consumed by a single haunting question. What did I just see? The memory of the pale face in the puddle burned into their mind, its hollow eyes staring into them, not at them, as if it saw something deeper, something buried in their soul. The thought made their skin crawl. What was it? Or worse, who was it? A ghost? A trick of the light? The storyteller's chest tightened as panic began to creep in. They turned to their friends, Weslley and Sara, their laughter and carefree demeanor standing in stark contrast to the cold terror wrapping itself around the storyteller like a vice. Should they tell them? Should they say something about the man, about the whispers, about the blood smeared across the pavement like a dark omen? Their instincts screamed against it. If they spoke, what would happen? Would the man return? Would the whispers grow louder? The storyteller bit their lip, weighing the suffocating fear of silence against the dread of what might happen if they broke it. As the game continued, forced themselves to look at Weslley and Sara. They seemed untouched by the oppressive weight in the air, their movements light and natural, their voices echoing through the street. They hadn't seen the man, hadn't felt the chill, hadn't heard the whispers. How could they be so calm? Could it really be that none of this was real? The storyteller clenched their fists, trying to will the fear away. Maybe they were just imagining it. Maybe the stress of the week, the long nights without sleep, were finally catching up to them. But deep down they knew better. The blood was real. The man was real. The whispers were real. And somehow, they were the only one who could see it. The realization hit them like a cold wave. Why me? What had they done to deserve this attention? What did the man want? The tension became unbearable as the thoughts spiraled. A choice had to be made. They could pretend nothing was wrong, force themselves to join in the game, laugh along with Weslley and Sara as if everything was fine. But the unease wouldn't let them. The shadows seemed to deepen with every passing second, pressing in closer, watching, waiting. The storyteller felt their breath quicken, their pulse racing as they stole another glance at the far end of the street. And then they saw it again. Movement. A faint, almost imperceptible shift in the darkness. It wasn't the man, at least not fully. It was the outline of his shape, wavering like smoke, as if it were barely tethered to the reality around it. Froze, their heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sounds of the game. The shadow moved closer, slow and deliberate, its form rippling unnaturally. The storyteller's legs screamed for them to run, but their body wouldn't respond. They were trapped, rooted to the spot by a fear they couldn't name. Weslley's voice broke through the fog, snapping the storyteller back to the moment. Hey, are you okay? You're acting weird. His tone was light-hearted, but his words carried an edge of concern. Sara turned, her eyes meeting the storyteller's, her smile faltering as she picked up on their unease. The storyteller opened their mouth, ready to spill everything. The man, the face in the puddle, the whispers, but the words wouldn't come. They couldn't risk it. Not yet. Instead, they forced a smile, shaking their head. I'm fine, they lied, their voice trembling. Just tired. Weslley shrugged and turned back to the game, but Sara lingered, her gaze searching their face as if she could sense the weight of the fear they were hiding. But before she could say anything, the ball rolled back into play, and she was drawn back into the moment. Stood there, paralyzed by indecision. Should they investigate the shadows at the end of the street, confront the source of their fear head-on? Or should they stay where it was safe, or at least safer, with Weslley and Sara, pretending the darkness wasn't inching closer with every passing second? Every instinct screamed at them to run, to grab their friends, and get as far away as possible. But the curiosity was just as strong. What was it? They wondered. What if this is my only chance to find out? The pull of the unknown, as terrifying as it was, gnawed at the edges of their mind. The storyteller knew the risk, but they also knew they couldn't live with the questions clawing at their sanity. Finally, took a hesitant step toward the edge of the light, their heart pounding in their chest. The shadows seemed to shift in response, as though welcoming their approach. A cold sweat broke out across their forehead as they took another step, and another, until the faint sounds of Weslley and Sara's laughter began to fade behind them. The darkness loomed ahead, thick and impenetrable, its depths promising answers, but at a price. They paused at the edge, glancing back at their friends one last time. Their voices were distant now, muffled by the thick air, their figures barely visible in the dim light. Swallowed hard, summoning every ounce of courage they had. And then, with a deep breath, they stepped forward into the unknown, knowing that whatever awaited them on the other side could change their life forever, or end it. The air grew colder with every step, each one feeling heavier than the last as the storyteller approached the edge of the shadows. Their breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, the night pressing down on them like an unseen weight. The laughter of Weslley and Sara was now distant, distorted, as if coming from another world. Ahead, the darkness seemed alive, shifting and pulsing, as though it were a living thing waiting to consume them. Then they saw it. The figure of the man materialized out of the blackness, emerging with the same unnatural gait as before. His form flickered, indistinct, as though he existed halfway between this world and something far worse. The heart pounded against their ribcage, every instinct screaming at them to run, but their legs refused to move. They were rooted to the spot, frozen in terror, as the man limped closer. This time, the light of the nearby street lamp illuminated him more clearly. His skin was ashen, almost translucent, stretched tightly over his gaunt frame. His eyes were hollow sockets, black and bottomless, yet somehow they seemed to stare directly into the storyteller's soul. Blood dripped from the open wounds on his arms and legs, but it didn't fall naturally. It oozed upward, defying gravity, disappearing into the air like smoke. The man stopped a few feet away, his head tilting unnaturally to the side, a grotesque mimicry of curiosity. He raised one hand, trembling and skeletal, and pointed directly at the storyteller. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if each motion carried an unbearable weight. The storyteller felt their chest tighten, their breath catching as an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. And then he spoke, or rather, something spoke through him. The voice was layered, dissonant, as though 100 whispers were speaking in unison. The words were unintelligible at first, a garbled mess of sounds that sent chills down the spine. But as they listened, the noise began to form words, phrases that struck like daggers into their mind. You see me. You shouldn't see me. Stumbled back, their legs trembling, but the man didn't follow. He simply stood there, his form flickering in and out of focus, as if the light around him couldn't decide whether to reveal or hide him. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing in their ears even as the man remained silent. Shadows seemed to ripple outward from his feet, spreading across the pavement like ink spilled in water. Desperation clawed at the storyteller's mind. They turned to call out for Weslley and Sara, but the words died in their throat. When they looked back, their friends were gone. The street was empty, the game forgotten. The world felt wrong, distorted, as though reality itself had been pulled apart. The street lights flickered violently, casting jagged, erratic shadows that seemed to stretch and move on their own. The man stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural, his skeletal hands still outstretched. Stumbled back again, nearly losing their footing, but the man's voice, or whatever was using his body, stopped them cold. You can't leave now, it said, the words vibrating in the air like the hum of a tuning fork. Suddenly, the shadows surged, rising up around like a tidal wave. Shapes began to form within them, twisting, writhing figures with no discernible faces, just dark outlines and glowing, empty eyes. They surrounded the storyteller, closing in with a suffocating presence, their whispers joining the cacophony in their mind. Clenched their fists, tears streaming down their face as they fought the urge to collapse. Every fiber of their being screamed that this wasn't real, that they could wake up and escape this nightmare. But the sharp sting of the cold air against their skin and the overwhelming pressure in their chest told them otherwise. This was real, terrifyingly, horrifyingly real. The man's head snapped upright, his empty eyes locking onto the storyteller. His mouth opened wide, unnaturally so, as if his jaw were unhinged. A low, guttural sound erupted from deep within him, building into a deafening roar that shook the ground beneath their feet. The shadows surged forward, and for a moment, the storyteller was certain this was the end. But just as the darkness closed in, something changed. A faint, flickering light appeared in the distance, a single point of warmth cutting through the cold, oppressive blackness. It was weak, barely visible, but it called to the storyteller like a lifeline. With every ounce of strength they could muster, they broke free from their paralysis and ran toward it, the shadows clawing at their heels. The roar of the man and the whispers of the shadows followed them, growing louder and more furious with every step. The light grew closer, brighter, until it enveloped them completely. And then there was silence. The cold was gone, replaced by a warmth that felt almost too good to be true. The storyteller collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, their body trembling from the ordeal. When they looked back, the street was empty once more. No man, no shadows, just the quiet night and the distant sound of crickets chirping. But they knew the truth. The man wasn't gone. He was still there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. And now he had seen them. He had chosen them. The silence was deafening. The storyteller remained on the ground, every breath trembling as they tried to piece together what had just happened. The light that had saved them was gone, leaving behind only the cold, empty street. But something had changed. The air felt heavier, as if the darkness itself was pressing down, watching, waiting. The heart pounded in their chest, every beat a desperate reminder that they were still alive. For now, they slowly stood, their legs weak and unsteady, scanning the street for any sign of the man or the shifting shadows. It looked normal, as if nothing had happened. The flickering streetlights cast long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement, and the distant hum of the neighborhood had returned. But something deep inside told them it was far from over. This wasn't the end. As they turned to head back toward where they had last seen Weslley and Sara, their eyes caught something glinting faintly on the ground near the far corner of the street. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it drew their attention like a magnet. Against every instinct, they moved closer, their feet dragging as if the air itself resisted their approach. When they reached the spot, they froze. There, smeared across the pavement, was a message. Written in what appeared to be blood, the words glistened under the faint light, their meaning chillingly clear. "You can't escape what's already inside." Stomach churned as the words burned into their mind. What did it mean? What was inside? Panic clawed at their thoughts, their breathing quickening as their eyes darted around the street, searching for anything, anyone, that could explain this nightmare. And then they felt it. A presence. Cold and unrelenting, it pressed against their back, raising every hair on their body. Slowly, against their better judgment, they turned. The man was there, standing just a few feet away, closer than he had ever been. His hollow eyes bore into theirs, the void within them pulling at something deep inside the storyteller. His jaw hung slightly open, his cracked lips forming a wordless scream that sent a shiver down their spine. But it wasn't just the man. Behind him, the shadows were alive again, twisting and writhing like a sea of darkness. They reached out toward the storyteller, their forms vague but undeniably human, their faces distorted and featureless. They moved with purpose, as if drawn to the storyteller by an invisible force. And then the revelation came. A memory surfaced, fragmented, incomplete, but unmistakable. The storyteller saw themselves as a child, standing in a darkened room, holding something in their hands. It was small, delicate, a trinket they couldn't fully make out. The memory shifted, the shadows in the room growing darker, larger, until they consumed everything. And then a voice echoed through the memory, once marked, always followed, gasped as the realization hit them like a tidal wave. This wasn't the first time. The man, the shadows, they had always been there, lurking at the edges of their life, waiting for the right moment to return. The storyteller's chest tightened as pieces of their past fell into place. Moments of unexplained fear, fleeting glimpses of figures in the dark, nightmares that felt too real. It all led back to this. The man tilted his head again, his empty eyes locking onto the storyteller's with an intensity that made their knees buckle. His mouth moved, forming words that didn't match the sound that came out. It was a guttural, layered noise, as though multiple voices were speaking through him at once. The storyteller struggled to comprehend the words, but one phrase stood out clearly. "You called us?" Tears streamed down the storyteller's face as they stumbled back, their mind racing. How could they have called this? What had they done? The memory of the trinket resurfaced, clearer this time. It wasn't just a trinket, it was a key, an object they had found as a child and kept hidden, never understanding its true nature. The storyteller realized with dawning horror that it had been a tether, a link to the darkness that now surrounded them. The man stepped closer, the shadows surging forward with him. The body screamed to run, but their legs refused to move. The air grew colder, the whispers returning, louder and more insistent, filling their mind with incoherent words and emotions. Fear, guilt, and despair overwhelmed them, threatening to pull them under. And then, as the man reached out a skeletal hand toward their chest, the light returned. It was faint at first, barely more than a flicker, but it grew rapidly, pushing back the shadows and forcing the man to recoil. The light came from within the storyteller, radiating outwards, as if something deep inside them was fighting back. The shadows hissed and writhed, their forms dissipating as the light consumed them. The man's hollow eyes widened, his expression shifting for the first time to something resembling fear. He stumbled back, his form flickering like a dying flame before vanishing completely. The street was silent once more. They collapsed to the ground, their body trembling as the light faded. The words written in blood were gone, and the street was as it had been before, quiet, still, and deceptively normal. But the storyteller knew the truth. This was far from over. The man and the shadows weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, and they would return. As they sat there in the darkness, the storyteller made a vow. Whatever they had done to call this nightmare into their life, they would find a way to end it. But the truth remained, they were marked. And once marked, the darkness never truly lets go. The street was quiet again, eerily so, as if the world had reset itself after the encounter. The storyteller sat on the cold asphalt, trembling, their chest heaving with each shallow breath. The light that had saved them moments ago had vanished, leaving only the dim glow of the flickering streetlights. Yet, the air still carried a heaviness, a sense of foreboding that refused to leave. They glanced around, their eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, every patch of darkness. The man was gone, but his absence didn't bring relief. Instead, it left a gaping void filled with the promise of his return. Slowly, they got to their feet, their legs weak and unsteady. Their mind was a swirling storm of fear and confusion. What had just happened? What had they seen? And most terrifying of all, why had it chosen them? Questions clawed at their sanity, demanding answers they weren't sure they wanted. Each step they took toward where Weslley and Sara had last been felt like an eternity, the silence around them amplifying the pounding of their heart. When they reached the spot, it was empty. The ball lay still on the ground, forgotten, its once playful presence now feeling ominous. Weslley and Sara were gone. No signs of their laughter, no footprints in the faint layer of dirt that covered the pavement, nothing. It was as if they had never been there at all. A deep, gnawing panic set in. They called out, their voice cracking in the oppressive silence. "Weslley? Sara?" The words echoed into the void, swallowed by the night. There was no response. The storyteller's throat tightened as the realization began to sink in. Whatever had happened, whatever they had seen, it hadn't just marked them. It had taken something. It had changed something. They weren't in the same world anymore, not entirely. Desperate, they began to walk toward their house, their footsteps quick and uneven. The houses lining the street, once familiar and comforting, now felt alien, their darkened windows like hollow eyes staring down at them. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional crackle of the streetlights. Shadows seemed to move at the edges of their vision, always just out of reach, taunting them. When they finally reached their front door, they hesitated. The house, their sanctuary, now felt wrong. The lights inside were off, but the faint outline of the furniture through the windows seemed unfamiliar. Twisted, distorted, as though the space had been rearranged by unseen hands. They swallowed hard, forcing themselves to step inside. The air inside was cold, much colder than it should have been. It clung to their skin, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent they had noticed earlier. The house was silent, unnervingly so. Every creak of the floorboards beneath their feet sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. They flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The darkness was unrelenting. As they moved further into the house, they noticed small changes, subtle, but enough to send chills down their spine. Picture frames hung crooked, their glass cracked. The clock on the wall ticked backward, the hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. And then there was the mirror in the hallway. They stopped in front of it, their breath catching in their throat. At first glance, their reflection seemed normal. But as they leaned closer, they noticed something was off. The reflection was smiling, an unnatural, too wide grin that didn't match the terror etched on their actual face. The smile grew wider, the eyes darker, until the reflection reached out toward them. The storyteller stumbled back, their heart racing, but when they looked again, the mirror was empty. No reflection, just darkness. They fled to their bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them, their mind racing. They curled up on the bed, clutching a pillow to their chest, their eyes scanning every corner of the room. They didn't sleep that night. They couldn't. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw the man, his hollow eyes staring into their soul, his whispers echoing in their mind. You called us. You can't escape. Morning came, but it brought no comfort. The sunlight felt weak, barely piercing the veil of dread that hung over them. The house was quiet again, unnervingly so. Weslley and Sara didn't call. No one did. The world outside seemed distant, disconnected, as though the storyteller had been cut off from it entirely. They sat by the window, staring out at the street where it had all begun. The pavement was clean, no sign of the blood or the man or the shadows. But they knew it wasn't over. The sense of being watched, the weight of the unseen presence, it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface of their reality. And then, as they looked out at the empty street, they saw it. A figure at the far end, standing perfectly still, its form barely visible in the daylight. It didn't move, but the storyteller felt its gaze, heavy and unrelenting. Their chest tightened, their breath catching as the figure began to dissolve into the shadows. The storyteller knew the truth then. The man, the shadows, they weren't gone. They were waiting, watching, and they would return. The storyteller was marked, bound to a darkness they didn't understand, and no amount of light could ever truly keep it away. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a nightmare they would never escape. The days that followed felt like walking through a dream, no, a nightmare. The storyteller moved through their life as though they were underwater, every sound muffled, every action slow and deliberate. Nothing felt real anymore. The world around them seemed unchanged, yet everything about it felt different. The street was the same, the neighbors still went about their routines, and Weslley and Sara reappeared as if nothing unusual had happened. But the storyteller knew better. Something had shifted, and it couldn't be undone. Each night, as darkness fell, the terror returned. It began with a feeling, a weight pressing against their chest, making it hard to breathe. The shadows in their room seemed to grow longer, darker, twisting unnaturally. And then came the whispers. Faint at first, like a distant hum, but growing louder with each passing second. The voices were layered, chaotic, their words indistinct but filled with malice. Sleep became impossible. Every time they closed their eyes, they saw him, the man with the hollow eyes, standing in the corner of their room watching. He never moved, never spoke, but his presence was suffocating. The storyteller would wake up drenched in sweat, their heart racing, gasping for air as if they had been drowning. During the day, they tried to return to normal life, but it was futile. The strange occurrences followed them everywhere. Objects in their house moved on their own, subtle at first, like a chair slightly out of place, or a book falling off a shelf. But then it escalated. Doors slammed shut when no one was near them. Mirrors cracked spontaneously, their reflections distorted and unnatural. The sound of footsteps echoed through the halls at night, slow and deliberate, always stopping just outside their bedroom door. The storyteller stopped telling anyone about what they were experiencing. Weslley and Sara laughed when they first tried to explain, dismissing it as a prank or an overactive imagination. Even strangers seemed uncomfortable around them, their eyes darting nervously as if they could sense the darkness that followed. The storyteller was alone, trapped in their fear, with no one to turn to. One evening, as they sat in their living room, staring blankly at the flickering television, a cold breeze swept through the room. The windows were shut, but the air was icy, carrying with it the faint, metallic scent that had haunted them since that night. The TV screen crackled, the image distorting before going completely black. And then, for just a moment, the man's face appeared on the screen, his hollow eyes staring directly at them, his mouth forming the same eerie, wordless scream. But the silence didn't last. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with their chaotic voices. The walls seemed to pulse with the sound, vibrating as if the house itself were alive. They clutched their head, tears streaming down their face as they screamed for it to stop. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The house was silent once more, but the storyteller knew it was only a matter of time before it happened again. The man wasn't gone. He was never gone. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. The storyteller tried to make sense of it all, piecing together the fragments of memory and experience. They revisited the trinket from their childhood, the object they now believed had tethered them to this darkness. It was still hidden in their home, a small, unassuming thing that seemed harmless at first glance. But the moment they touched it, a wave of dread washed over them, confirming their fears. This was the key, the anchor that had connected them to the man and the shadows. Destroying it wasn't an option. They had tried, but the trinket seemed indestructible, impervious to fire, water, or any other means of destruction. It was as if the object itself was alive, tied to something far beyond their understanding. They thought about throwing it away, burying it, or leaving it somewhere far from home, but deep down, they knew it wouldn't matter. The connection was already made, and it couldn't be severed. The days turned into weeks, and the storyteller began to change. The fear never left, but it became a part of them, a constant companion in their waking life. They stopped going out at night, avoiding shadows and dark corners like their life depended on it. They became hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, constantly on edge as if the man would appear at any moment. But the worst part was the growing sense of inevitability. The storyteller couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out, that the man wasn't just watching but waiting. Waiting for what? They didn't know, but the thought gnawed at their mind, driving them deeper into paranoia. One night, as they lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers returned. This time they were different, clearer, more purposeful, and among the chaotic voices, one phrase stood out, repeated over and over like a chant. It's time. It's time. It's time. Breath caught in their throat as the shadows in the room began to move, coalescing into a familiar shape. The man stepped forward, his hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, his skeletal hand reaching toward them. This time, there was no light to save them, no reprieve from the nightmare. The last thing they saw before the darkness consumed them was the man's face, inches from theirs, his mouth twisting into an unnatural, toothless grin. And then there was nothing. No sound, no light, no feeling, just an infinite void. The next morning, the house was empty, was gone, their belongings left untouched, their bed neatly made as if they had never been there. Neighbors spoke of strange noises the night before, but no one could explain the disappearance. The trinket, however, remained. It sat on the windowsill, its surface gleaming faintly in the morning sun, waiting for its next owner. Waiting to mark someone else. Waiting to begin the cycle again.